lesson 1, we worked on congruence, and we proved congruence, if the two figures are congruent, if we could somehow do a transformation to get it sitting on top of the other figure. For example, we would take one figure and we would reflect it, and then translate it so that it was sitting on top of the other. And if they matched up, that's how we knew those two figures were congruent. Well, in lesson 2, they're going to kind of show us a different way to prove congruence. Okay, so this is lesson 2, so go ahead and open your books. Okay. Corresponding parts of congruent figures. They're going to show us two different ways to prove that two figures are congruent. Okay. The first way is that they're going to take a figure here, two figures, and they're going to put some markings on them. This allows us to show what sides are congruent and what angles are congruent. So if we take a look at the first triangle here, triangle ABC, okay, if you take a look at side AB, do you see how there's one tick mark right here? If you take a look at side DE, do you see how there's a tick mark here? Because this side has one tick mark and this side has a tick mark, that means that they're going to be equal. Okay, let's look at side BC. Well, side BC has two tick marks. So we go over to this figure and we look, EF has two tick marks. So BC and EF are congruent because they have the same number of tick marks. Okay, and again, side AC, that side has three tick marks. So we come over to this figure and we look, well, what side has three tick marks? DF does. So those two sides are congruent. So if we're looking at sides, what you can do is look for tick marks. And you match up the number of tick marks, and those sides are going to be congruent. Those are called corresponding sides. Corresponding means they're matched together. Okay, so AB is matched to DE. They're corresponding. And then the same thing goes for angle measures. If you look at angle A, do you see how there's one mark in there? So we come over here and we look. Well, angle E has a square root, or a square, meaning it's 90 degrees. Angle F has 2, so that doesn't match up, so we have to look for the one that has 1. So angle A here has 1, and so does angle D. So we can say angle A is congruent to angle D. Angle C has 2 marks, so if we come over here, angle F has 2 marks. So we can say angle C is congruent to angle F. And then the same thing for angle B and angle E. They both have the squares, meaning that they're both right angles. So this is one way that they're going to show you how two figures are congruent. They're going to do it by markings. The other way that they're going to show us is by congruent statements. If you take a look right here, it tells us triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Okay. Now, this little statement tells us a lot. Okay. If you look, A is in the first spot for this triangle. If we look in this triangle, D is in the first spot. Because they're in that order, we know that angle A is congruent to angle D. Well, let's look up here. Is that true? Yes, it is. So even if they didn't give us these two triangles, we can just look at the congruent statement and see what are congruent. Angle B is in the second position, so is E. So those two, angle B and angle E, are going to be congruent. Again, if you look up here, that's true. And the same thing with C and F. They're in the last position, so those two are going to be equal. And the same thing goes for sides. If we take a look at AB, right here, AB, they're in the first two positions, that means that side AB is going to have to be congruent to side DE. Well, let's check. AB has one tick mark, DE has one tick mark. They're congruent. So you can look at the congruent statement and you can tell just by that what's going to match up because they have to be in the same positions. We could say side AC is congruent to DF. Okay, and that is true. They're also going to want you to write these out. So they're going to want you to do congruent angles. So you're going to have to write them out. Angle A is congruent to angle D. This is the congruent sign. It's an equal sign with a little squiggly. Angle B is congruent to angle E, and angle C is congruent to angle F. Then they want you to do congruent sides. Side AB is congruent to DE, side BC is congruent to EF, and side CA is congruent to FD. Okay? Let's take a look at an example. Okay. In the figure below, the two triangles are congruent because triangle DEF is the image of triangle ABC reflected over line M. Again, that's kind of what we learned last lesson. The notation, triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF, is read. The triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. That's how you read that statement right there. Okay. The parts of congruent figures that match or correspond are called corresponding parts. So corresponding means matched up. Let's look at example 1. It says write congruent statements comparing corresponding parts in the congruent triangles. Okay, so they want us to write congruent statements. Here are your congruent statements right here. First, they're going to look at the angles. Okay, they're saying that angle J is congruent to angle G. Well, how do we know that? Angle J has 1 mark, and angle G has 1 mark. Okay, they're saying angle L is congruent to angle I. Here's I with 2 marks. Here's L with 2 marks. And angle K is congruent to angle H. So K and H have 3. And this is how you write a congruent statement. Okay? Here's the other congruence statement that they want you to write. They want you to use sides. Okay, they're saying corresponding sides, JK is congruent to GH. So JK right here has 1 tick mark. So should GH. Yep. Okay. And then they match the other 2 sides up. This is how they want you to write congruent statements, okay? So why don't you right now pause the video, and why don't you try the got it problems. They want you to write 2 congruent statements, 1 for corresponding sides, 1 for corresponding angles. All right, let's see how you did. Let's start with corresponding angles first. Let's check your angle measures here. Okay, well, if we look to see what matches up, we know that A and M match up because they've got 1 tick mark. We know angle N and angle B match up because they've got 2 in their angles. O and K match up because they're 90-degree angles, but so are P and S. So how do we know that O and K go together and P and S go together? Well, you got to take a look at where they sit. These 2 match up, these 2 sides match up, and these 2 sides match up. So that means these 2 angles match up, okay? So here should be your congruent statements for your corresponding angles. Angle M and angle A, angle N and angle B, angle O and angle K, angle P and angle S, okay? All right, let's check and see what you've got for your corresponding sides. Okay, there's 2. Angle MN right here, and angle AB. Okay, those both have 4 tick marks, so those are going to be congruent. They match up. NO and BK, so here's side NO and here's side BK. They match up. And then here are the other 2. Oops. OP and KS match up, side OP and side KS, and then also MP and AS. So in this problem, what they wanted you to do, they wanted you to look at the corresponding sides and make sure the markings match up. Okay? Let's look at another example. Example 2. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ. So now they're telling you what's congruent through a congruent statement. Okay, write congruent statements comparing the corresponding parts. So instead of them marking the figures this time, they're giving you a congruent statement right here. Okay, they're not going to make the marks on here, they're just going to do this. So what we know is that A matches up with X, B matches up with Y, and C matches up with Z. Those are your corresponding angles. You can do it with the sides as well. AB is congruent to side XY. BC is congruent to YZ. And then you can do the ends. AC is congruent to XZ. Okay? So what they want you to do in your got it problem, they're going to ask you to write congruent statements. One for the corresponding angles, one for your corresponding sides. Okay? And then they're going to ask you to determine which transformations map triangle ABC onto triangle XYZ. This is kind of going back to lesson 1. What do you have to do in order to get this one mapped on to this one? Well, in this case, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to reflect this triangle first to get the orientation the right way. Then you're going to have to translate it 2 units down, okay, to get it to map. And since it's on a coordinate grid, you can be more specific. You can say you have to reflect it across the y-axis, and then you're going to have to translate it 2 units down. You know that you have to take it 2 units down. All right, let's look at your got it problem. Parallelogram WXY Z is congruent to parallelogram KLMN. Write a congruence statement comparing the corresponding parts. So that's where you write your two congruent statements. Then determine which transformations map parallelogram WXYZ onto parallelogram KLMN. So go ahead and pause the video and try to do this problem. Okay, since they didn't give you any markings on your figures, you have to use this congruence statement right here. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write that congruence statement out. Okay? Right here. And now that we have this written out, now we can compare congruent sides and congruent angles. Okay, let's take a look at your congruent sides. Okay? If all I did was I didn't even really look up here, I used this congruent statement. Okay? WX and KL match up, so they're corresponding sides. XY matches up with LM. YZ matches up with MN, and then we can do the ends. WZ, right here, matches up with KN. So these are your corresponding sides. Now your corresponding angles, those are pretty simple because they just match up. Okay, so there are your corresponding angles. W and K match up. Angles X and angles L match up. Angles Y and M match up, and angles Z and N match up. Again, that just came from this congruent statement right here. The last thing they want you to do is determine what transformations you need to do. Okay? So in order to get this figure mapped onto this, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to have to reflect it across the x-axis. So let's take this and let's reflect it across the x-axis. So when we do that reflection, it's going to look just like this. Okay? So we have to reflect it across the x-axis. Then we're going to have to translate it. Let's see how many units we have to translate it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we had to reflect it across the x-axis and then translate it 5 units right. Those were the 2 transformations that we had to use. All right, let's look at the last example here real quick. Finding missing measures. Now that you know that corresponding figures or congruent figures have corresponding angles, it's very easy to find missing angles. Okay? In this figure right here, triangle BCE is congruent to triangle DFG. They're saying if angle CEB is 50, okay, so angle CEB is right here, and that's 50. What is the measure of FGD? So FGD is right here. They're corresponding angles, so they're going to be congruent. So if this is 50, this is going to be 50. Same thing with your got it problem. Okay, if CE is 2 feet, here's CE. If this is 2, what is the length of FG? Well, if this is 2, then this has got to be 2. They're congruent. They're same shape, same size. So if this is 2, this has got to be 2. Okay? So what I would like for you guys to do right now, go ahead, try your got it problems, and we'll discuss it Monday in class.